The last episode in this series was about leftist media liberation theory. The neo-Marxist idea that mass and social media are at the center of today's society and that they must be liberated. This is to say, media need to be expropriated from the corporations or the government and become a public forum where everybody can be free. I talked about an essay by the German writer Hans-Magnus Enzensberger, who envisioned a media revolution. This revolution was supposed to result in an anarchist or socialist media network owned by no one or by everyone. Mass and social media were envisioned as a new life world of equality, an open sphere of political activism. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard replied to Enzensberger with a very critical essay. He found Enzensberger's ideas not just naive and utopian, but worse, based on a complete misunderstanding of what mass media are and how they work. Baudrillard's essay was not just a takedown of Enzensberger's media liberation theory, though. It was, at the same time, a concise groundwork for Baudrillard's own major theoretical works of the 1970s. It anticipated the concepts of simulation and hyperreality, which Baudrillard is famous for. Today's episode first looks at Baudrillard's media theory, and then at the concepts of simulation and hyperreality that followed from it. Enzensberger had published his essay Constituents of a Theory of the Media in 1970. Baudrillard published his critique 2 years later, in an essay which, in English translation, is titled Requiem for the Media. The essay begins with a dramatic overstatement. Whereas Enzensberger had claimed that there was no Marxist theory of the media, Baudrillard says even more generally, there is no theory of the media. This overstatement indicates a claim to philosophical rigor. Baudrillard insists only he is doing real theory. Everyone else before him had just been speculating. What is more, the statement also expresses a claim to authenticity or originality. Baudrillard claimed doing something no one did before him. Baudrillard begins his essay by zooming in on what he considers two failed attempts at media theory. First, Marshall McLuhan's writings. He labels them mystical on the one hand, and on the other hand, merely empirical. There was no systematic, coherent theory in McLuhan, according to Baudrillard, just some more or less random insights and metaphors. Second, in much more detail, Baudrillard rejects Marxist media theory, which he accuses of immense retardation. He finds Marxist media analysis too materialist or economic, and accuses them of being stuck in traditional theories of the mode of production. A true media theory for Baudrillard needed to be founded on semiotics, on a theory of signs, codes, and communication, instead of simply rehashing the old Marxist concept of class struggle. With the intention to refute it, Baudrillard sums up Enzensberger's Marxist media liberation theory very succinctly. He writes, "The left dreams of a media takeover. The media are monopolized by the dominant classes, which divert them to their own advantage. But the structure of the media remains fundamentally egalitarian, and is up to the revolutionary praxis to liberate the media, to return them to their social vocation of open communication and unlimited democratic exchange." Baudrillard's refutation of Enzensberger then builds on a crucial theoretical difference between Marxist and his own media theory. He says, "Always the same dream haunts the Marxist imaginary. Strip objects of the exchange value in order to restore the use value." This means for Marxists, mass media have an underlying use value. They are useful for human communication. But capitalism has alienated this use value by commodifying media. It made media private property and thereby turned them into a means for profit-making. A communist revolution will return the media to the people, making them public property and restore their original use value, which has been obstructed by the focus on commercial value. But Baudrillard thinks this analysis is totally wrong. According to him, the media have no pure use value. They've never just been useful, but as mass media, they have always been somehow alienating. For Baudrillard, precisely this idea that mass media can be liberated so that their pure use value will come to the fore is at the heart of a naive and utopian Marxist misconception of mass media. Unlike Enzensberger's utopian view, Baudrillard's view of the mass media is much more dystopian. Very similar to Debord's often dystopic view of the media as spectacle. Baudrillard makes two closely related critical points about what mass media essentially are. But both points were not as original as he probably liked to think. First, media are ideology. Second, media do not connect but separate. So first, media are ideology. For Baudrillard, the media are not simply a means of communication, enabling exchange between people. Instead, they are ideological. They impose a certain way of living and of thinking. He writes, "It is false that in the present order the media are purely and simply means of distribution. The media are not coefficients but effectors of ideology." This is, in somewhat more obscure language, the same idea McLuhan had already expressed years earlier. The medium is the message. Mass media are not just neutral tools delivering messages. They establish a new lifestyle, a new form of being human. In this way, no matter what they say, they are first and foremost a new social practice, a new ideology. Second, media do not connect but separate people. The ideology of mass media is, paradoxically, the opposite of true exchange. Baudrillard writes, "Media ideology functions at the level of the separation it establishes, which is a social division. And the mass media fabricate non-communication. This is what characterizes them. If one agrees to define communication as an exchange, as a reciprocal space of a speech and a response, and thus of a responsibility. This is to say, by their very definition and by the use of technology, media do not connect people, but separate them from one another. They insert a medium between people. Moreover, as mass media, they do not function like true reciprocal dialogue between two individuals. Rather, they function beyond individual communication and spread a sort of anonymous mass discourse by anyone, directed at anyone. Baudrillard's idea that mass media separate rather than connect individuals was also not that original. It too had already been expressed, for instance, by Guy Debord in paragraph 29 in The Society of the Spectacle, which says, "Isolation underpins technology, and technology isolates in its turn. All goods proposed by the spectacular system, from cars to televisions, also reinforce the isolation of the lonely crowd." Much later, in 2011, basically the same point was applied in relation to the internet and social media by Sherry Turkle in her book Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. Baudrillard combines the idea that the medium is the message with the idea that mass media separate or isolate people in the catchphrase, "speech without response." He gives an example of a non-dialogical fake, or as he calls it, simulated speech, democratic elections or polls. For Baudrillard, elections are mass media as well, because they are a form of standardized mass speech that, as he says, answers itself via the simulated detour of a response. In an election, people do not authentically express their political views. Their responses are prefabricated on the ballots. A vote is a simulated rather than a real political response. Consequently, Baudrillard disagrees with Enzensberger's assumption that media enable mass participation. and that taking ownership of them empowers people. For him, mass media and the technological objects they rely on, like TV sets, are merely functional objects, setting up ready-made responses. He writes, as if owning a TV set or a camera inaugurated a new possibility of relationship and exchange. Strictly speaking, such cases are no more significant than the possession of a refrigerator or a toaster. There is no response to a functional object. Its function is already there, an integrated speech to which it has already responded, leaving no room for play, a reciprocal putting in play. Unlike Enzensberger, Baudrillard does not think that mass media can become interactive and mobilize people. To the contrary, from Baudrillard's perspective, even today's social media can be understood as a simulation of interaction rather than real interaction. The possession of a smartphone is also not more empowering than the possession of a toaster. Rather than emancipating people, smartphones, like toasters, are also merely functional objects, and the apps on them are integrated speech, prefabricated forms of pseudo-communication. Rather than enabling people to freely play with one another, these apps play with the people that use them. Baudrillard did not share Enzensberger's optimism regarding future social media networks. Enzensberger believed on social networks everyone would become an activist, an artist, a creative writer or a speaker. But Baudrillard was probably more realistic in foreseeing the future of creativity on social media when he wrote, "We know the results of such phenomena as everyone making their own cinema, a kind of personalized amateurism, the equivalent of Sunday tinkering on the periphery of the system." Here, Baudrillard seems to describe politically harmless and aesthetically empty amateur videos decades before they became reality on TikTok or YouTube. Importantly, the fact that mass media suck people into a speech without response is for Baudrillard social control in itself. Media control people by conditioning how they speak and how they interact. They condition the whole life world. The mass surveillance the media engage in is only the icing on the cake of social control. Much more fundamentally is how mass media program human behavior. The same could be said about social media today, which also manifest social control in itself, controlling human behavior on a much deeper level than the mass surveillance they also simultaneously perform. Different from Enzensberger, Baudrillard rejects any revolutionary potential of mass media. Once broadcasted, social subversion has already sold out. Social protests become staged, or as Baudrillard says, neutralized into signs, eviscerated of their meaning. Instead of promoting real revolution, mass media co-opt and stifle anything revolutionary and use it for their own purposes. In effect, the medialization of politics turns politics into an apolitical media spectacle. Baudrillard says the media are in pursuit of the political act in order to depoliticize it. One may think of today's co-opting of protest movements en masse and social media, its transformation into wokeism by corporations and mainstream political parties, or of the self-profiling of social media influencers who take part, for instance, in Black Lives Matter marches. It's profile politics. As soon as it is displayed on the media, political subversion becomes a conformist performance, a mere virtue signaling. As Baudrillard says, the subversive act is produced like a gesture. Obviously, Baudrillard's analysis of the apolitical, conformist, and inauthentic nature of mass media are close to Debord's depiction of the spectacle. De Boer had already called the mass media the most stultifying, superficial manifestation of spectacle. But Baudrillard's analysis also foreshadows some ideas in Niklas Luhmann's media theory, which I will get to later in this series. Baudrillard comes very close to Luhmann when he describes the mass media as a self-producing and self-reproducing system, which Luhmann would call autopoietic, based on its specific code. Here are some pronouncements by Baudrillard that sound quite Luhmannian. At the limit, the medium no longer acts as a medium, but as an autonomous system administered by the code. Or, the code becomes the only agency that speaks, that exchanges itself and reproduces. It is no longer people who exchange. The system of exchange value reproduces itself through them. Unlike Enzensberger and leftist media liberation theory, both Baudrillard and Luhmann see the mass media from a decisively non-humanist perspective. Media do not enhance human agency. They are not manipulated by the people. Instead, the media are a self-reproducing system of communication, imposing its code on society. The speech without response of the media is not the speech of individuals. Mass and social media are instead a system of signs or a system of communication that uses people for its own endless self-reproduction and for the reproduction of its code. It's a matrix one cannot exit. Apps do not enable people to speak, but people enable apps to function. Here's a short summary of Baudrillard's media theory. Mass media do not promote exchange between individuals. They are an encompassing system abolishing real exchange and replacing it with simulated responses. Media separate rather than connect people. Participation in the media does not offer possibilities of real resistance or subversion. Politics, as well as protest, become media performances and are thereby depoliticized. The media turn politics into a display of gestures or the curation of profiles. Social control is embedded into the media system. Mass media are not externally controlled by individuals or politics or the economy. Instead, the mass media form an autonomous, self-regulating system that conditions people and society. As mentioned, Baudrillard's analysis of the mass media was a basis for his famous concepts of simulation and the hyperreal. Both concepts, which are closely connected, are discussed in Baudrillard's book Symbolic Exchange and Death, originally L'échange symbolique et la mort, first published in 1976. Baudrillard's notion of simulation is, to begin with, a semiotic concept. It's about signs, their exchange, and their meaning. Here's a sort of definition by Baudrillard himself. Simulation in the sense that signs will exchange among themselves exclusively without interacting with the real. The emancipation of the sign, released from any archaic obligation it might have had to designate something. The sign is at last free for a structural or combinatory play that succeeds the previous role of determinate equivalence. The semiotic idea, derived for instance from the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and the philosophies of Wittgenstein and Derrida, that Baudrillard uses here, is this. We should understand the meaning of signs, first and foremost, in relation to other signs, rather than, for instance, in relation to specific objects they designate. In this way, signs constitute certain language games, which are ultimately disconnected or emancipated from objective reference. Systems of signs constitute their own virtual reality, disconnected from an objective reality. Accordingly, simulation consists of simulacra, virtual copies which, paradoxically, cannot be traced back to any original. A simulacrum is a copy without original. Similar, let's say, to characters in a video game which do not represent any actually existing person or creature. Simulation, or the creation of simulacra, results in what Baudrillard calls hyperreality, which in many ways corresponds to the now common idea of virtuality or virtual reality. It's a simulated reality, detached or emancipated from real reality. Baudrillard defines hyperreality using the inevitable postmodernist expression always already as that which is always already reproduced. According to Baudrillard, today reality itself is hyperrealistic. Everything we see in mass and social media has become hyperreal. The economy, politics, love and sex, you name it. Baudrillard claims that today the simulation principle dominates the reality principle. This is to say that the traditional semiotic logic of representation has been reversed. Traditionally, the function of signs or images was to represent. A sign was supposed to correspond to and be derived from reality. In this way, the reality principle dominated the world of signs. Under the simulation principle, however, signs and images no longer represent realities. Signs and images now dominate over reality by creating their own hyperreality that has more value and is more present than traditional reality. No longer dominated by reality, today's life is dominated by hyperreality. Most of Baudrillard's later almost mass-produced texts apply the ideas of simulation and hyperreality to concrete social phenomena, such as, for instance, the very short book The Gulf War Didn't Take Place, published in 1991. Baudrillard argued not that the Gulf War of the early 90s was irreal, but that it was hyperreal. Its media display was detached from its actual reality. It became a media spectacle. While, of course, many people died on the ground, the imagery of the war produced in the media did not represent the actual war, but constituted its own virtual hyperreality. Most people in the world experienced the Gulf War not as an actual reality, but as a simulated hyperreality. Or to give you an example that Fai just told me about. He just visited to the Chinese province of Sichuan, where he saw a large field of lavender. Now, this field of lavender was also hyperreal, because the lavender was planted there not for any agricultural reasons, but only for touristic reasons, so that people could take photos of themselves with the beautiful lavender in the background. So in this way, again, the image determines the reality, the agricultural reality, rather than that the image sort of represents a true agricultural reality. So this, like perhaps the phenomenon of tourism in general today, is another good example of the concept of hyperreality. Here's a remark on Baudrillard's style. Well, frankly speaking, he tended to exaggerate and to wail. Like in the first sentence of his essay against Enzensberger, "There is no theory of the media," Baudrillard often used quite dramatic overstatements. Similar to Debord's reflections on the spectacle, Baudrillard also expressed sorrow in the face of an irretrievable loss of the real. Baudrillard too seems to have suffered from authenticity nostalgia. Here are some examples from Symbolic Exchange and Death, where Baudrillard appears as a kind of drama queen, lamenting the death of all kinds of things. This is the end of labor, the end of production, and the end of political economy. all the great humanist criteria of value, all the values of a civilization of moral, aesthetic, and practical judgment vanish in our system of images and signs. This is the generalized brothel of capital, not the brothel of prostitution, but the brothel of substitution and interchangeability. The loss of referentials first mortally affects the referentials of the revolution. It has become a sign among signs, produced and consumed like the rest. Well, we've now reached not the end of the world as we used to know it, but only the end of today's episode on Jean Baudrillard's media theory. The next episode will deal with a theorist who was less dramatic, but not necessarily less alarmist than Baudrillard. And instead of dealing with the hyperreality of the media, he was much more concerned with the actual reality. Next time around, I will look at the media theory of Noam Chomsky.